right. Sorry, I can't move with this mic because it's attached to way too many different things. So I'll try to move back and forth. Normally, I would give you an introduction to the speaker, but it's me. So hopefully I hate doing this. Let's see, I've been here for 24 years now at the University of Washington, Tacoma, started in 1999. I got my PhD at MIT before coming out this way. I really enjoy what I do, working with undergraduates on research, and otherwise enjoying the amounts of sound. So, and try not to lick my fingers when I'm around arsenic contaminated areas. So that's about all I can tell you about me. Without further ado, we'll talk about arsenic. For those of you who aren't familiar, the picture in the background is the former Asarco smelter stack in Ruston, Washington. So that's what it used to look like before the, what are they, $500,000 condos that are going up in that area. So you can see down on the bottom left, that was the whole Asarco smelter operation down on the waterfront. That whole area is in the Tacoma, what was the or what is now the Tacoma Yacht Club Peninsula or Dune Peninsula that you walk out if you go exercising out there. That is all slag from the former smelter. So all that land didn't exist before. It's basically built out from the amount of material that was dumped in the water from the Asarco operations that went on for close to 100 years. So it's a little bit cheap, but that's what it looks like. I got interested in this. I did some studies on arsenic when I started on the East Coast around Boston. When I came out here, I thought, oh, it's the pristine West Coast. What am I going to study with this job up here? And then it turns out my house is not, it's kind of in the picture somewhere up in the right-hand corner. And then I realized that my backyard was contaminated with arsenic and lead from the smelter. So yes, whenever an environmental chemist and engineer says yes, worry. I find it interesting, maybe exciting is the wrong word to use, but definitely it gave me something to do since I think. So this is the work that we've been doing for quite a while. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sources of arsenic smelter. So it turns out they used to use it as a beauty product. It gave you a pale color, which was all the rage. It turns out, and I've learned since then, the same thing now, mercury-containing products are used for skin whiteners now. Same thing, bad idea. So this luckily went away. Maybe you can find some old stuff, but I love the idea of smearing toxic stuff on you so you get a film help. Coal-fired power plants are a big one, so it's just an impurity in a lot of these things. So you get some in the coal, get a lot of different metals and other impurities that come out of coal. Pesticides and herbicides. So around here, some of these pictures are actually, the ones in the bottom left are from Eastern Washington. So you used to spread a combination of lead and arsenic on fruit crops to actually keep bugs away. And that stuff, it's metal. So if you don't know your chemistry, the metal will always be a metal. It can't change to anything else. So whatever you sprayed on the ground is going to be there for a really long time unless it gets eroded and washed away somewhere. So that stuff still exists in the orchards, the older orchards on the east side as well. And you can still find if you go through somebody's really old products, like some you are emptying out an old shed or something, you might find some of these old pesticides that are really toxic sitting around. So it used to be used as a clothes dye. So that's actually what this is. It was a really in vogue green color that it gives you if you put an arsenic-based dye in your clothing. Well, it turns out that it rubs off on the washerwomen and the people who wear it. And so this was what this political cartoon was talking about at the time, that people would die from wearing these fashionable colors. Dye for fashion. It is still used in antibiotics for livestock and for sheep dip, which is not something you eat in crackers. It is something you dip the sheep in while they're still alive. It keeps the pests off of their pelts, basically, eating the wool and everything. It's also been used in treated lumber. It's been since taken out, but treated lumber that used to be used to raise gardens and things had a combination of all kinds of fun things in it, including arsenic, copper, and chromium as well. And then it's obviously in mine tailings and drainage, and then smelting, which is what we're focused. All right, so the Asarco smelter started up in the late 1800s. It was originally a lead smelter, and then there was no money in lead, and so they switched to copper. The wild thing is there is no ore for this kind of stuff anywhere near here. So the ore was shipped up from South America to Ruston, Washington, where it was processed. And so that creates a whole lot of material. Smelting leaves, like you get a little bit of metal and a whole lot of waste material, which is why there's this giant peninsula that was built out of the waste material that was extra. So they switched to copper. They then also, it turns out the source of copper that they were getting happened to be high in arsenic. And at that time, there was there still is a market for arsenic for a lot of different reasons. So pesticides and herbicides manufacture, and now for superconductors and things along those lines. So they actually specialized in high arsenic ore. So not only was it an impurity, it now was a really high concentration of purity in the ore that we got. Then the tall stack was built. So it used to not have a stack. Now I need pictures before that. The reason the stack is built because smelting actually puts out sulfur dioxide, which when it mixes with water, gives you sulfuric acid. And it was killing people's plants and gardens in the neighborhood. Nobody liked the black spots left on the roses. It actually, you can see if you go to some old churches in North Tacoma, where you can see the effect of localized acid rain was etching away the stone on the old churches out there still. And so they built a stack. So as the idea was that the solution to pollution is dilution. So by putting it higher up, the wind blows it, spreads it out, and supposedly have less problem. It did reduce the problem that they were having in the local area. It no longer killed people's gardens right there. But what it effectively did was allow that to be transported farther away from the smelter than it was originally. So for a very short time, this was the tallest stack in the world. And then I think a year later, it got built out, beat out by the smelter stack in Sudbury, Ontario, which I've also done research on. So I feel like I'm a specialist in really big smelter stacks. And then they did some special things in the 1970s where when the wind, because if you remember, we have mountains on two sides of us, and Cascades, pointing the right way, I don't know. Cascades on one side, the Olympics on the other side. So the wind tends to go kind of north or south, depending more or less. And so when the wind would blow back towards Tacoma, the weird way the peninsula is shaped, it would cause that smokestack to actually kind of move and hit the ground really close to the stack. And so that was causing problems again. So they would stop operations when the wind would blow south. When the wind would blow north towards King County, they would let it ride. So that's part of the reason is you'll see that when we got more pollution to the north and west when we got to the south and east. So this is a video, let's see if it works. So just to show you, unfortunately, I couldn't get the
Commencement Bay, her rippling waters rise up with the tide. 'Twas there that Mr. Rust's great dream to be did decide. And men would come from far and wide to work the smelter's trade. And they'll come to North Tacoma where the copper dreams are made. From South America come ships all topped with copper ore. And they'll travel down through Puget Sound to meet the furnace roar. And when the job was through, the copper to markets would go. And the sparks will fly to fill the dark sky and set the night aglow. Oh, farewell now, the swing shift whistle's blown its final day. Farewell to the smokestack or Commencement Bay.
And they did it in dramatic fashion because they could have actually disassembled it, but it's pretty small. So they did break it down. It's wild because if you look at some of the videos, there is a giant gathering. I don't know if you're around Safeco, the Kingdom came down, right? So everybody was watching that. This one's loaded with like that smelter brick, actually the stack brick gets loaded with contaminants. And so there's everybody just joking on this stuff, but you can't do dust control. on that one. So everybody was there filming this thing down. So why are we interested? So it's a class A human carcinogen, which means it's one of the few that we know. We have plenty of evidence that shows that it causes cancer several different times, causes non-cancer effects as well, and it also has ecological implications. So the part of ecology modeled exactly where they would expect higher concentrations of arsenic and lead to be deposited by the smelter, and because of those wind directions, again, it tends to be either north and west or south and east because of the way the mountains make wind flow. But you can see the wind flows higher, like higher velocities and more consistently north and west than it actually blows back the other direction. So all those lakes that you see on that map, we have sampled this in. And so this is what we found to start with, is that sure enough, we find higher concentrations of arsenic and lead, and we don't show that here, in those lakes that are where we expect them to be from the smelter. Those big red dots we will come back to. So those are two of the big lakes that we're going to study a lot. So the one to the north is Angle Lake up near SeaTac, and the one to the south is Lake Killarney, which is a small lake right off of Highway 18, where it comes off from Highway 5 or I-5 near the old warehouse or property that was out there. So those are two of our big ones to study. But you'll notice that kind of parallel or perpendicular to those in directions, you don't find high concentrations with the wind that's carried that. So we're interested in this one because people still use these areas. There's nothing that cordons them off. People do actually rely on these places for food. So there's definitely, it's not really known how many people rely on this for their protein substance and harvested fish and so on. So there's not a lot of good data for who's at risk exactly. That's one part of the work we're trying to do in the future. And unfortunately, arsenic, it tends to, as we'll talk about, it gets buried in the sediments, but it comes back to life under certain conditions. So we'll talk about what that is. So it doesn't really go away. So the smelter has been shut down for quite a while, and we still have just as high concentrations in the water as with that around that. So that's what we're interested in here. So this is all of illuminology in one slide. So if you want to check out the fact that you took this class, this is it. And my graphics, sorry, that's all you get. So this is a lake. You couldn't tell what that is. You're going to simulate this, by the way, in those beer glasses on your table here in a second. So during the winter months, sort of late fall to early spring, tends to be cold outside, if you haven't noticed that, and windy, and that actually creates the same temperature throughout the lake. It's called isothermal, so it's the same temperature everywhere, which means that the lake can mix because everything's the same density, same temperature. So therefore, oxygen that comes into the surface gets mixed all the way to the bottom, and oxygen's there. Turns out oxygen is really important for the release of arsenic. That's why we're talking about it. So if you remember, we do get warm months occasionally. So they happen a little bit later than now, as it turns out. Once it gets warm, the water at the top, right, the sunlight hits the top, it warms up the top layer. But it doesn't penetrate all the way through the lake because there's other stuff that kind of blocks it or scatters the light or absorbs the light. So it only kind of penetrates to a certain depth. And that actually heats up only a certain layer of the lake. So the temperature at the top of the lake is higher, temperature of the lower part of the lake is lower. And if you remember your high school chemistry, or soon to have high school chemistry, cold water is more dense than hot water. So hot water kind of sits on top and it won't mix. So that actually creates a barrier to mixing with the rest of the solute. It's called thermocline. If you want to win some bar bets, remember a few of these words and pull them out for your friends later. And then we get lots of algae growth in the top of these lakes. They're all urban lakes with lots of inputs from lawns and failing septic systems and road runoff and other things. And when those critters die, they sink to the bottom and bacteria break them down and they use all the oxygen in the bottom. So what happens is the oxygen's high at the top where the water can still mix in oxygen from the atmosphere, but you basically get rid of all the oxygen in the bottom usually by late spring. And then that means it's what we call anoxic, so no oxygen. That allows arsenic to come out of the sediments. So if you have these conditions, which we do in almost all of our urban lakes around here, arsenic then can get released from the sediments and come back. But because there's that barrier, arsenic will get released at over 10. And with the classic idea is that arsenic stays in the bottom, right? And there's this barrier to mixing. So just like the oxygen can't get down, arsenic can't get up. So that's what we always thought. So it's unless you're somebody who dives to the bottom and drinks a bunch of water, you're probably pretty safe. And because the oxygen's not there, the fish also don't hang out at the bottom because there's not enough oxygen to breathe. And therefore, fish are also not taking up arsenic because they tend to hang out up above. Makes sense? So that's the idea, is that the classic idea is that the arsenic really shouldn't be a problem because at most, maybe at certain times of the year when the lake mixes, but it'll be a very short time. So then it turns out we found out that's wrong. Well, it's true for deep lakes, but a lot of people don't study shallow lakes, which is why we're here today. So these are the two lakes that I showed from those red dots, if you remember. So Angle Lake is over 50 feet deep, up in SeaTac, and Lake Killarney's, it says it actually gets down to about 13 feet. That's, you're lucky if you find it. So it's somewhere like at this time of year when the water level is quite high, it might actually be 14 feet deep or so. During the summer, it's probably around 12. But it's a much shallower lake than the both of them, it turns out, have about the same amount of arsenic in the mud at the surface. So they're both about 200 parts per million of arsenic right at the top. And you'll notice that the Asarco smelter shut down, if you remember, back in the 1980s. So why is it still high today? Well, that's because the arsenic keeps coming up out of the sediments and then getting deposited again on top. And so it keeps moving back to the top of the mud and it keeps not getting buried in the process. So it keeps coming back to haunt us for a bit. So they both have the same concentration of arsenic in their bottom water. So if they were working the same, we would expect them to be similar otherwise. So this is a Rorschach test to see if you can tell what this is trying to show you. What this is on the top two panels, so Killarney's on the left, Angle's on the right. Lake Killarney temperature, if you'll notice, it gets warm all the way to the bottom. You have a different scale. So Lake Killarney is only this, sorry, I have to use metric units because scientists who have published in those journals. So it's about 3 meters deep on the left-hand side, or a little bit more than that. So you can see that the red gets almost down to the bottom, which means that the water temperature is warm all the way to the bottom. Whereas Angle Lake, you'll notice that you get some of that blue and stuff and green underneath. So that means it's actually colder at the bottom during the summertime and it stays warm up top. So that's that difference in the layers that we saw, that we talked about before. So it turns out Killarney is shallow enough that it doesn't really build up permanent layers in the lake. We'll have a calm week or a couple of calm weeks in the summertime. That'll cause it to stratify or cause those layers. But then we'll get a windy, cold week, and that'll actually mix it again. So that's actually one of the things with these shallow lakes is they don't permanently layer up throughout the summertime, which is part of the problem. So the bottom panels are showing you the concentrations of arsenic. So if you'll notice in Killarney, not only is there these big red patches at the bottom, but that gets mixed up into the water columns. You see some of those more high concentration colors kind of smearing up into the water column. That showed us that arsenic is actually getting up where it shouldn't be, right? There's oxygen up there, and we thought that oxygen would keep arsenic from, like, it should get rid of arsenic. But it turns out if you do it fast enough, the arsenic doesn't have a chance to actually kind of come back out. And so if you keep pumping it back up, you're going to end up with a concentration at the top that stays high. That's what's going on. Whereas in Angle Lake, you can see that basically there's high concentrations, but it's only right at the very bottom of the lake, and so it never gets up into the top. All right, so we wanted to know what's going on, what's in the bottom. So these are called pore water keepers. So what you get is you get a diver in the deeper lakes to go down and put these in the mud. So they stick halfway in the mud and halfway above the mud. And in this case, you put a bunch of vials in there, you sample them, let them sit out there for a couple of weeks. And you can measure what's going on in the pore waters of the water spaces in between the mud and the water that's above the mud. That's what you're looking at, right? So if you look at Lake Killarney on the left, it's got really high concentrations of arsenic in the pore water in the mud. That's over 1,000 parts per million, or parts per billion, which is huge, right? Very high concentration. For comparison, the drinking water standard is 10. So it's 100 times higher at least. Whereas Angle Lake, remember, which has the same concentration of arsenic in the mud, only gets up to about 50 parts per billion in the pore water. So something very different is going on in these two lakes, even though they have the same concentrations of arsenic stuck in the mud. So the arsenic is not coming out of the mud in Angle Lake like it does in Killarney, for instance. And so what we looked at was, it turns out that temperature difference matters. So it's a 10 degrees Celsius difference between the bottom of the shallow lake versus the bottom of the deep lake. And when we take sediments from those lakes and put them in an incubator back at the lab, put one at 10 degrees and one at 20 degrees, we can force the arsenic to come out of Lake Angle Lake when we raise it to 20 degrees, and we can stop the arsenic from coming out of Lake Killarney if we lower it to 10 degrees. So it turns out that just that temperature difference is a huge driver of the microbial processes that are going on in the mud, and that accounts for the difference. So just that temperature difference. So shallow lakes are going to have a problem because they get warmer at the bottom. All right, and then I like to build things that I call that are way out of my league, and really we don't know how to do it, so I call them stupid fun. So we want to do something, so we wanted to install some instruments in this lake, but the instruments can't move. So you have to build, which is really hard to do in a lake. So you can't just buoy it up there. So we have to drive this thing into the bottom of the lake. So we built, so a former student of mine built
Get
a
it,
platform.
Alex, get it. Get it.
On a platform in between two different boats. We enter the boats, then Alex, who's a professor up in Seattle, we all took turns hammering this sucker down into the bottom of the lake. And then we guy it out with a whole bunch of wires and giant concrete anchors.
Well, that's a question for you. So what do you, how far up do you want it?
The residents all called it the maypole, so that's kind of what it looked like.
I would say if we can get the
the
joint
fun part was actually getting back
below
out.
the water.
So what we did from that was trying to figure it. So we know that arsenic comes out of the mud, but how does it get from the bottom of the lake to the top? Something has to get it up, right? And so Sam Funk, who's a grad student that works with me in Seattle, and our collaborators up there, Becca and Alex, who you saw, she looked into this, and it turns out the process that goes on is exactly what you're going to do right now on your tables, okay? Or while I'm talking. So if you could, there's an empty beer glass on your table. So if you can go up and fill that about 2/3 full with cold water out of that thing over there. Okay, not the white thing, because that's hot water. The other thing we need to do is put hot water in the cup that's the styrofoam cup that's upside down on your table. So get some hot water out of the pitcher that's being there. Okay. And you only need enough hot water to kind of top off your glass. Cool. Got it? Everybody grab stuff. We're going to do some science. And it's probably somewhat tepid water this time. It's really water. And then pass those to the other two. Here you go. All right. So we should have colored hot water, right? Blue or green, doesn't matter. And you should have cold water in your glass, correct? All right, so here's the trick. There's a spoon on your table. So somebody who hasn't had a whole lot of caffeine today, or at least recently, you want to pour the colored hot water over the spoon right above the cold water so that it goes in the glass but doesn't plunge. Does that make sense? So you want to carefully pour it into the top of your glass so that it doesn't actually mix all the way down. So kind of get that spoon down in there as best you can. Turn the spoon the other way and put your spoon all the way down there. Now, it's much into the glass if you can. Other way. There you go. Kind of flatten it if you can. You can bend these spoons. I don't even know how the days are. The other way you can do this is if you tilt, if somebody tilts the cold water a little bit, it allows you to get the spoon there a little bit better. See if this works. It's not the easiest thing. You guys got it? You don't need a lot of the blue or green water. So when you're done, you hopefully, if you look carefully, you should be able to see like darker on top and clearer on the bottom. Can you? Excellent. Sweet. Got it? How's that looking? Look good. Don't mix it up. Be real gentle. All right, now make sure you see that, right? So if you, as you kind of let it sit, you should see a pretty good defining line between the color, at least like the deeper color and the lighter color, right? So that's what we call those, that's those lake layers, right? So warm water staying on top, cold water's on the bottom. Now, very carefully put one ice cube on top, and that should be in the other cup that you have on there. So just don't plunge it, just very carefully put an ice cube floated on top. If it's a small ice cube, you might add a second. So watch, pay attention to what happens there as we go on. You see something? I see something on the table back there. What do you see happening? Or am I just seeing things? What's going on? Are you seeing, what are you seeing happen? There's no theory here. You may need to add another ice cube. It's not quite cold. So if you watch that for a little bit, you start to see something. You'll see some weird action going on, right? You'll start to see some movement near the bottom of the color. And let it sit there for a bit. Okay, so that's exactly what Sam figured out was going on in these shallow lakes. So during the daytime, the temperature is warm at this rate. That's when the sun comes out, it turns out. So the sun warms things up and the bottom's a little bit cooler. So the sun comes and basically raises the temperature at the top. The bottom stays just warm, but not as hot as the top. At night, the air temperature drops. In a lake that's small enough, it actually drops enough where the temperature at the top cools down to the temperature at the bottom. And that actually causes what was at the top to mix down, right? Because it gets cold enough that it actually gets more dense and it starts to drop. Make sense? What that does, because water is now dropping, that displaces water that was down below, and that moves water from down below up. So that's called convective mixing. So basically, that's what's happening in these shallow lakes every night, is you're getting this thing set up where the arsenic that got released during the day near the bottom now gets moved up into the oxygenated top waters during the night. Makes sense? And then there's oxygen up there, so eventually as that stops during the day, some of that sinks out, and then it does it again every night. Makes sense. And it's a slightly different from day to day, depending on what's going on with other weather patterns, but that's the gist of what's going on. Hopefully you can see. Okay, and if you let it sit there, you'll see that it will mix for you as you're sitting there doing it. Okay. Cool. All right. That was a lot of audience participation. You guys are awesome. Give yourselves a round. Okay, so this is just to show that daily pattern. You can see the same thing. You get these kind of changes in temperature, and you get these spikes in arsenic that we see. So we did not sit out there for 24 hours a day, but we had an auto sampler that was sucking samples every 6 hours to see what was going on when it was working. When it wasn't working, we got nothing. And amazingly, it also stayed there in an urban lake, which is a whole other thing. We talked about putting it. All right, so we now know that arsenic comes out the bottom. We know that arsenic gets up to the surface water, but we do know that arsenic doesn't just stay there, right? Otherwise, the concentration would keep getting higher and higher throughout the summer. And so we put these things, these look horrible, but these are called sediment traps. So you put these out in the lake, and they're meant to catch things that fall down. So particles that are trying to fall to the bottom of the lake, they catch. And you pull a sample bottles off. So it turns out, these are 4 different lakes we've studied. But as you notice, Lake Killarney, which is on the bottom left, there's really high concentration of arsenic showing up in those sediment traps. So the arsenic is coming up and then dropping. Basically, it's getting deposited again, but we're catching it as it goes down. Does that make sense? So it's not that the arsenic comes up and stays there. It's just that it keeps coming up every night and it keeps coming back down. So you kind of you have a steady state, higher concentration of arsenic that ends up in your lake. Steel Lake is another shallow lake that we studied, so same idea is going there, whereas Angle and North Lake are both deeper, and you can't see it, so they're basically never getting that arsenic, because you're never getting that full mixing of the lake on a regular basis, so we'll talk about the elements. What that means then is that arsenic is not only coming up into the water, it's actually coming up and getting redeposited into shallow areas of the lake, right? So the lake tends to be well mixed horizontally, but not vertically. So it actually comes up and then gets redeposited. Normally, all your pollutants kind of build up in the deep part of the lake because they're stuck to sediments, and eventually wave action and other things moves those sediments to the bottom, deepest part of the lake. But because these arsenic things keep coming back up, they keep putting arsenic back into those nearshore areas, which potentially means higher exposure. So not only is there higher concentrations in the water, there's higher concentrations in the nearshore mud where a lot of crews live. And it turns out people play. So this is where it gets into the phytoplankton. So the bottom, so that the microscopic plants in the lake, we can see high concentrations in Lake Killarney compared to Angle Lake, which is the one right below it. So that's around 600, 700 parts per million of arsenic in the little algae. So that's super high for comparison. And then it gets into the zooplankton, which are the things that eat the phytoplankton mostly. So it's lower. So that's a big deal. So it turns out, unlike if you're familiar with mercury, right? So what happens to concentrations of mercury as you move up the food chain? Higher, they get higher, right? So it turns out because they are in the fatty, to build up in the fatty tissues of things, that allows them to accumulate in the fish, because we all have excretory systems that get rid of water soluble things. We don't do well at getting rid of fat soluble things. So mercury builds up in the fat tissues, and then as things eat, more and more gets accumulated, it's multiplied as you go up the food chain. Arsenic's the opposite. So it turns out it's water soluble. We can excrete it, both humans and other organisms. So the higher up the food chain you go, the lower the concentration of arsenic usually is, which is great. If you're eating high on the food chain, well, it kind of is a trade-off, right? If you have mercury problems as well, there's no good thing at that point. So, but higher up the food chain is usually good. So notice the concentrations go down by about a factor of 10 when you go from phytoplankton to food. And then it turns out the same sort of thing. So we found out that it's all about the amount of arsenic that gets up into those oxygenated waters, because that's where the critters are. So if we plot the amount of arsenic in the oxygenated waters versus the amount in the snails, turns out we get a good correlation. So the more that gets up into that water, the more you find in the snails. So these are Chinese mystery snails, which are, by the way, a food source. That's why they were originally brought there, an invasive species, non-native species. It was originally brought into the US as a food source for Chinese laborers working on the railroads in California, because there's large communities in China that still rely on snails as their primary protein source. Because they're really easy to grow, you kind of don't have to do anything. They actually do have good protein. If you have escargot, you're eating the same thing. There's a lot more fancy sounding and it's more expensive. But these are snails that are like the side of the golf ball. So they build up in snails, they build up in crayfish, which we do know people are harvesting. We just don't know really how much and out of which lakes. There's an entire Facebook group about crayfishing in Western Washington, and they're an interesting bunch. And nobody wants to give away where they go crayfishing. And they really don't trust scientists or anybody from the government. So getting any good data, that's going to be completely impossible. But we do know people are doing it. And then sunfish, which are those what I call panfish or stuff, micro-feeding these, so bluegills, pumpkin seed sunfish, that kind of stuff. Those are those. The reason that we're looking at these is that these are the fish that survive. They're warm water fish, so they can survive and reproduce in these lakes from year to year. So they're living in these lakes long enough to build up concentrations. They stock these lakes with rainbow trout. Fish and Wildlife does this every year. But that's like a you fish it operation where they dump them in April or March, and they're caught within a couple of weeks pretty much. So they're really not in the lake long enough or during the right times of year to see higher concentrations build up in those what we call sport fish. Plus, they can't reproduce in the lake because it's too warm for them. So the trout and other salmonids, like they can't handle they would want to be at the bottom of the lake, but if you recall, there's no oxygen at the bottom of the lake, so they can't survive and reproduce. So we know these are getting into these different organisms, and it turns out that there's enough that's getting into, especially some of these. So it turns out snails, because they're directly feeding on the algae on the bottom. So they're only one removed from the very base of the food chain. So they have some of the highest concentrations of arsenic. So snails, even in some of the lower concentration lakes, are still too high to eat. So they would give you one meal of snails a month would be over the threshold for cancer risk from arsenic in these things. Same thing with crayfish. So at least crayfish in Killarney and steel, even for what, so there's different percentiles, by the way. Mean is just your average eater, right? So some people eat these kind of organisms, some don't. So the mean is basically the mean of the entire population. So that's not very protective of populations that are higher eaters of these things. 90th percentile is what we think of as sport fishing or recreational fishing. So that tends to be the protective level that you use for that population. For subsistence fishers, people that rely on higher concentration or higher fish intake or seafood intake, or especially things like tribes, Southeast Asian populations in this area, depends on which group you're talking about, what particular seafood. The concentrations, right, that's your 99th percentile that you're using as a protective measure. So you'll notice that when it's red, so anything that has color is above the cancer risk threshold, right? The redder it is, the worse it is. So the cancer risk threshold we usually use is about one additional cancer risk in 100,000 people. But the red one is 1 in 1,000. So it's a really different, it's a very high concentration for the subsistence strains. So what that essentially means for those in Lake Killarney, if you ate 2 meals of fish a month in Lake Killarney, that would be over the cancer risk threshold because of comparative likelihood. But again, the problem is we don't know who's doing that. Anecdotally, when we're out there sampling, I see, like, I can tell the populations, and it's not the people that live on the lake. They aren't doing that. They're not. They might be catching fish, but they're putting it back. People that are actually catching them and taking them home, especially these warm water fish throughout the year, that tends to be, there's definitely a transient population, a homeless population. There's people who don't live, they live in the area, but not on the lake, because that's high rent, right? So it tends to be lower income families, especially different ethnicities, non-white families. So we see those on a regular basis. But we had no data to show, and we had no way to know to communicate, because in a lot of cases, literacy is an issue. The number of languages, they already try to post in multiple languages, but even that's tough to do, and people don't read the signs. And usually you post at the boat ramp. Most people that are fishing for this kind of stuff, they don't have a boat. That tends to be a more well-to-do population, so you're not hitting. It's hard to know how to communicate the risk in a way that matters. Skip that. So it just turns out the different types of fish. We went back and did this with Fish and Wildlife. So some fish species, because of the way they feed, had much higher concentrations. So carp and smallmouth bass, for whatever reason, seem to have really high concentrations compared to the other fish. And again, kind of getting back to this idea of high amounts in the nearshore sediments, right? So somebody at a meeting, when I was presenting all this stuff about fish and stuff, they're like, so is it okay if my grandkids go and play in the lake? And I used to think about like the concentration in the water. Usually when you swim the lake, the amount of water you actually drink in is not, it's not drinking water, right? You're not sucking in 2 liters a day. If you are, you've got a whole nother problem of drinking 2 liters of water from an urban lake on a regular basis. But it turns out that that idea of high concentration, so we find the same concentration of arsenic in the nearshore mud as we find at the bottom of the lake. So that opens it up. So we get kids going in from the shoreline, stirring things up. We were interested in what does that potentially expose them to in that scenario. So enter my student Kirsty. So we were trying to simulate nearshore child play, and human subjects does not allow us to go hire a child to go stomp around in an arsenic-laden lake, turns out, or sample the child. And so what we did was we simulate what would happen when a kid was playing around. So this is what Kirsty's doing from the side of the boat. So she basically, as she called it, whipping and mayonnaise for a minute. In this case, the tough part is she's in a lake where she went to get out of the boat. Normally she gets out of the boat and she moves around for a minute, and then we sample before and after what the concentrations are in the water that she stirred up. In this case, she started to sink. So she got out of the boat, she got into the mud, and then it was so gooey that literally I was losing Kirsty. And so she had to hang on to the side of the boat while doing her simulated child play on this one. And then we had a hard time trying to get her out of the mud afterwards. So we did a bunch of sampling in these lakes afterwards, and what we find is that stirring things up really matters. So you get, because of the sediment load that kind of gets kicked up with high concentrations, even though it gets diluted in the water, you end up with higher potential exposure. And kids playing in the lake are going to be incidental, right? So they're going to get, they tend to put their hands in their mouth, they drink some water, right? So we were interested in kind of how high those concentrations get that they might get exposed to in that way. So you can see kind of the farthest right bar in each one. You can see it's higher later in the season. And Lake Killarney is the two sets of bars on the right, and you get super high concentrations in there, and more when you start kicking around and stirring up those sediments. Right now, unfortunately, there's not a good way to predict risk from that, because there's not really a good model that people use to try to measure what the risk is from incidental contact in that sort of situation. So we've been working with the Department of Health and trying to understand how do we grasp, how do we make sense of these numbers and what this means for real risk, not just theoretical. So with that, I just want to thank all the members of the research group that have worked on this over the years, both in Seattle and Tacoma and elsewhere, and say thank you for listening to me talk. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to give away some prizes. So I'm going to give away raffle tickets to those people who don't have them yet. So hang on, see if we can give away some hits.
Do you want an hour again? I'm like, yeah.
All right. All right, you guys ready for some hats? Here we go. So first, number. Oh, damn. I brought the glasses. 1371186. Hey, congratulations, David. Come on, man. Golf claps. Thank you. You're still in. Okay. And one more hand to get with. 1371202. Hey, congratulations. There you go. All right, that was quick and easy. So just to remind you again, May 9th is our next talk. I hope you come back to hear all about Ellen's adventures that she did. And I will be back to hosting and not have to talk to you and running which I enjoy, but hopefully you get to learn something from somebody else. So without further ado, I can take any questions that people have. Yes.
One really quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know Don Russell.
I do know that.
I'll send an email to CBI power.
He sent me the same email. So Don Russell's a lake advocate who I've known for years. Yeah, I've known Don for, I think, since I started doing work in lakes here in 1999. So there's one of the ideas is as we're interested in is how do you now treat the lakes to remove the problem, right? So we don't want to just do the bad academic thing where you say, hey, here's a problem, it's really dangerous, and then walk away because you've done your part, right? So we're interested in how do you actually treat it to remove the arsenic or get rid of the problem. So one way is you try to trap the arsenic in the sediments. So our iron powder is one idea for doing that. There's other possibilities. As you can tell, one of the problems with our lakes is that they go anoxic, and so iron has a problem over time. That's what originally trapped the arsenic in the mud. But when the oxygen goes away, that iron releases the arsenic back into the water. So if you dump a lot of iron in there, it would have some effect, but we don't actually know what the long-term effect of something like that would be.
So it's similar to phosphorus.
Exactly, that's the idea. So phosphorus, you guys, so phosphorus is things that cause algae blooms in some of these things. So phosphorus in the sediment chemically looks exactly like arsenic. So that's why organisms take it up, is that it actually mimics arsenic, and the same transporters that take up phosphorus, which every organism needs, accidentally take up arsenic instead. And then arsenic gets stuck in the different molecules that phosphorus is supposed to be in your body, including things like your lipids and things like ATP and stuff that if you remember biology. So there's a big problem with phosphorus or arsenic getting stuck where it's not supposed to be. Cool. Yes, sir.
So I live on Stanley Lake,
Yeah.
and we're in the middle of, working with a lot of different, dynamic environment. Do you have any recommendations on how to treat that lake to prevent arsenic from coming up?
Gotcha.
And I have a follow-up.
Okay. Make sure we get everybody. But yeah, so Stanley doesn't have, it turns out it lucks out. So it doesn't end up having a super high concentration of arsenic, and it's deep enough that the deeper, like it's not getting a lot of that we're not finding arsenic at higher concentrations in the surface waters. So Spanaway kind of lucks out by the deepness of it and just sort of the fact that it had lower concentration of arsenic.
So then the last question on the floor, do you have any recommendations on the treatment for alcohol?
Yeah, you're really going to put me on that, aren't you? I'm doing contract work right now on Spanaway Lake. I'm sure you know. So there are multiple ideas on how you would treat that, as to what the most cost-effective one is that's amenable to and has lowest toxicity. That I don't know at this point without studying all the results.
Yeah, we're not in the kitchen about really.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I can definitely give you ways that will get rid of it. The tough part is finding the money sometimes to because
Not worried about
yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Are there any organisms that in their lipids or whatnot it sort of traps the arsenic so when they die that like fall to the bottom?
That's a good question. One of the things that we are interested in, the thing I showed about the different types of fish species, like different diets for the fish might explain some of it, but a lot of it doesn't make any sense. It turns out like smallmouth bass is a top predator, so they're actually farther up the food chain probably than a lot of these other critters, and yet they have some of the highest concentrations. So the idea that it doesn't build up as you go up assumes that the organisms sort of process arsenic internally the same way, and that may not be the case. So it's possible that some of these species actually shuttle arsenic into things that actually do build up more. For whatever reason, we don't know enough that this is all relatively new. So there hasn't been a ton of work on that. So we are interested because at least putting out, so the health department was starting to, we've been working with them on a consumption advisory for Lake Killarney because of the results we got. And then COVID happened. And that then sucked away all of the time of everybody at the Department of Health for years. And so we're just now getting back to the idea of looking at the possibilities, consumption advisories, and whether you can tell people. It's always nice because fish is good for you, right? So we want people, especially people that are on low incomes, right? You get a lot of good things out of fish. So there's a trade-off between the toxins that might be in a fish and the good things that you get out of it. So you're trying to figure out what that balance is. So rather than telling people don't eat fish, you want to say, is there a better lake they could go to? Is there a different type of fish that would be better for them to eat and focus on? And that's what you're trying to figure out. So you're not just saying stay away, because that's not really an option to a lot of people. So you want to figure out how you do it. And that's why we also want to treat it eventually, is because you can't just say, oh, nobody should catch fish in this lake, because that's assuming that people have a choice in a lot of cases, and that's not the case. Yeah.
Just to kind of follow up along the same lines, you said that there's challenges trying to set people in terms of language barriers or literacy barriers, and that there's plans to eventually we want to fix this. But what happens in the meantime is that this seems to really be affecting more marginalized, less franchised groups who, in that meantime, are still going to be affected by this. Is there anything that can kind of be done as a kind of stopgap between now and solving the problem?
And that's what we've been trying to work on. So part of it is identifying those populations and figuring out how do you communicate. So we've been doing some initial work on trying to do that. So I'm actually working with Denise Gawel, who's faculty member in nursing and healthcare leadership right now. On her I have her students out there actually collecting. Well, they're going to be this quarter collecting info on who is out there catching the fish on the weekdays, and like when you normally see these other kind of populations out there. So who that is. How much are they eating? So you're trying to, it's difficult work to try to do, but it's kind of the only way that we have to start to identify and figure out. The best way that we know of to actually reach populations is not through like standing there in the lake and trying to get the message across. What you're trying to do is figure out what community they're from and figuring out the groups that they associate with or they affiliate with. So you can then pass that message through their trusted groups. So that can sometimes be church groups, that can be like sort of ethnic community centers, right? So these, depending on which lake you're talking about, there's large Somali population in one. You get Hispanic population up your angle, although it's so this kind of you're trying to figure out where is it, like who it is, and then what are the best contact points and the best way for them to listen to what it is, and how do you then frame the message, right? Again, you don't want to tell just don't eat stuff, right? So you want to give an alternative. If you're going to go catch fish, this is a great way to go do it. We know this is safer, right? To use fish there. So that's what we're trying to do. It's just, it's not easy to just go post it, and like, we can do that, but I'm pretty convinced that won't happen. Yeah.
The field smelter have other responsibilities. I know they've done the usual stuff in trouble where they're stripping about soil.
Yeah, my backyard is gone because of that. So actually, I dug out my backyard because there was for those of you who don't know, so they started as a cleanup operation, right? But you had to be on a list, at least originally. And it was going to be years before they could come in and clean it up. But the guys at the time, which I'm pretty sure is not at all OSHA compliant, said, if you dig it up, you can bring it down here and dump it, because nothing had been developed down the waterfront. So my backyard is buried underneath of that really expensive development down there, and then tapped over, and then, yeah, all those condos are on top. So my backyard is somewhere down. So we started to dig it up, and my wife and I are both engineers, so we're like, we did the math, we're like, this is how many cubic yards it is. That's before you dig it up, it turns out. So once you start digging it up, so we borrowed a friend's truck, but we also don't own that. So we did, I think, 10 to 20 trips, and got really bad backs by that point. And the guys eventually kind of took pity on us and showed up one afternoon and just dug the rest out in about 30 minutes. So we kind of jumped the line a bit that way because we were trying to dig it out. So, so there is a cleanup thing, but this is outside of the negotiated contaminated area. So this is where Superfund is a legal thing. So the Superfund law is really a legal maneuver. And so you're negotiating with the responsible parties to try to get what you can get done. And so that's happened at this point. If you push them any farther, they are going to claim bankruptcy, and you're not going to get what. So you're trying to kind of find that, unfortunately, sweet spot. And so EPA has a vested interest in making sure they get that much cleaned up, right? So focus on the most contaminated areas and come up with that negotiated settlement. And there's still some yard cleanup going on at this point that's funded by longer term money, but these lakes are well outside of that zone, right? And so as far as, and like all of Vashon Island is heavily contaminated, and that's not in the same sort of, so there's a whole bunch of areas that are not covered by this. And that's always been the problem with Superfund sites, is that it draws an artificial boundary around where the contamination is. And once you come up with that big sediment, nobody wants to go back and reopen that can of worms. And so EPA doesn't want to do it because they want the cleanup to continue and the company to keep paying for what they're doing. And so and the company definitely doesn't have the interest in figuring out what else they might have contaminated. So often it gets purposefully ignored until somebody like the state decides to step in. So in this case, it's really about, if we show there's an issue, there might be a way to go after state funding or special like allocation funding for a particular project, not for cleaning up all of South King County and Vashon Island, which you just can't do. Right? So there's a feasibility link as well. Any other questions?
The wastewater plant, are they treated for it?
It's arsenic doesn't tend to mobilize too much in these stream water, so you might get a little bit of it, but compared to everything else, it's probably not a significant factor in the wastewater plants. They've got lots of other problems that they're dealing with that come from people dumping stuff down the drain, right? Or personal care products that we're now finding out are problematic. So there's a bunch of that stuff that they're more focused on. So they don't really have that issue. And we haven't gone to look so much in many of the stream waters and stuff to figure out what the concentrations are, but they're pretty well oxygenated, right? So it tends to be that there might be there, but unless people are really, if you found a patch somewhere and people are directly eating the sediment, that would be a problem. But my my guess is it's probably less of an issue. And it is, they are looking, like, one of the things they did start to look at is playgrounds, so there's a whole, like, public outreach piece, just like you're dealing with lead around houses, right? The same things go for arsenic, so how do you actually keep kids from getting into it as you make sure there's not bare ground in your area, that you clean off your shoes and stuff, you don't track dirt through the house. You tend to like grow vegetables, if you have a container in your yard, you grow vegetables and raised clip beds instead, if it's not in a good place. So there's kind of some standard things that work for both lead and arsenic for those sorts of things, and that's what they promote. The things where it's harder, like playgrounds, that's where they focus on that cleanup to make sure there's no direct, because kids are always in the dirt, like rolling around and can't keep it covered with grass, so it doesn't work around the playground, right? So you're trying to come up with those high probability areas and go after those. Well, I don't want to hold you any longer. It's that time. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you tomorrow.